we go. We
Oh,
meet again. What's up,
yep.
man?
Hanging in there. How about you?
Everything's good. What a great book, man. What a great um I've had so much fun going through this. I mean, being in jazz radio for 15 years, living my whole life in Kansas City, there's always something new that I learn about the
Mhm.
history and lore of Kansas City.
Yeah.
It's
No, it's
amazing.
it's sad that it isn't better known. And when I was out there doing research for the book, I went to the Jazz Museum, and I think they're selling themselves short. I mean, it's more of a general museum, not a Kansas City museum.
I agree.
So,
I totally agree. And that's why I really want to highlight and put this out in front, and maybe it can spark some interest. So this would be the perfect book to sell in that bookstore and that
I
gift shop.
know. Unfortunately, the publisher refuses to put out a paperback.
Okay.
And it's very expensive. And I asked them why. It's like, it's $60 retail. On Amazon, it's cheaper.
Yeah.
And I asked them why, and they said it's mainly for the academic market. And I go like, don't you want to sell books?
Yeah. Yeah. What are you doing? You know? So I want to get to the alpha of this process of writing about Kansas City jazz. What made you decide to dive? Because this is dense. This took a long time, I'm sure. How did you decide that you wanted to cover this?
Well, I grew up in Sedalia, 100 miles from Kansas City. It was its closest big city. And although it was kind of funny, there was American Bandstand in Philadelphia, and they had their theme song, and then there was Kansas City's version, and I forget the guy's name. Who He was a little uh, uh, the guy who was the Dick Clark of Kansas City. He kind of had his own theme song, and it was a different rhythm. And then, but it wasn't until I came to the East Coast that I picked up a early Count Basie album that I learned that he got his start as a band leader in Kansas City, and I go like, why haven't I heard about this?
Uh-huh.
And so when I started to research the book, I just on a whim, I looked around at the programs that Kansas City high schools, their jazz bands are playing, and there was no Kansas City stuff,
Yeah.
and I'm going like, well, there's already been two very good books about Kansas City jazz, but they weren't out of print, but they weren't really up to date. So I thought, and I saw a notice one day for a publisher looking for, books on jazz. They were coming out with a new jazz series. I said, I'd like to address this now and see if I can heighten the profile of Kansas City in the minds of a lot of people. Because you either think of New Orleans, Chicago, New York, and then if you're desperate, you think of Los Angeles because that's where the studios are. But Kansas City's played such a big role.
And the thing about Kansas City that I've noticed over this time that I've been doing the show since 2011 is that people are staying here now. They used to use this as a springboard, and there's a lot of cats that are coming in. I mean, Adam Larson came to town. There's a lot of people, but yeah, I mean, you got Charlie Parker, you have Pat Metheny, you have names like that. Even Bob Brookmeyer, I just read a book recently on him. He's not even seen as a central Kansas City figure, but this is where it all began for him. And a lot of those guys were running around in the heyday when Kansas City was the Paris of the Plains. Tom Pendergast let liquor flow freely, you know?
You know, I
So,
so I you kind of liken it to like the drain, like and it's in a good sense. So when Prohibition hit, all the entire Midwestern, nightclub scene was wiped out,
mhm,
except in Kansas City. So you
yeah,
got guys in Texas and Oklahoma and Minnesota who are saying, well, I think we ought to go to Kansas City. It's the only place where there's any nightlife. And that's just so remarkable that, and that's why I picked the title of the book, which is A Little Evil Will Do You Good.
what I thought.
It's because, they allowed a little bit of evil, if you consider alcohol to be evil, and I think we all understand it has its downside, then you get this gigantic flowering of an art form.
Yeah, you certainly do. How long did this take? How many interviews? What was the process to get this into this version?
Well, I hate to blow your misconception, but when I proposed it to Equinox, which is a British publisher, and they have a guy there named Alan Shipton, who's uh, a widely recognized world-class jazz expert. And he said, that's a great idea. Can you do it in a year? And I said, well, actually, well, first, I'm a former newspaper reporter and typesetter. I type fast, so that helps. But so I had all the records. I mean, I had all the Count Basie records. I had all the Jay McShann efforts. I had some Benny Moten records. I acquired some more in the process. I had Harlan Leonard. I mean, who's ever heard of Harlan Leonard,
Right.
Uh, and Benny Moten. And I said, well, I got all the records. I got all the liner notes. And I had the two previous books, Briggs and Haddox and Ross Russell. And I have to say, Ross Russell was the guy who started it all.
Yeah.
And I think his book is out of print now. It's by it was published by University of California Press. Uh, the Driggs and Haddox book is an Oxford University Press publication, and it's still in print. But they each had a different slant, and so I thought what I would do is take those two, and they were both written pre-internet.
Yeah.
So, for example, I had the benefit of genealogy websites, so I could find out if Hot Lips Page was related to somebody, and they couldn't, so they would have questions that they'd leave hanging out there. I I yield to them both in their knowledge. Certainly in the case of Driggs and Haddox, I mean, those guys know more about jazz than I do because I think they're both musicians. And Ross Russell certainly knows more about Kansas City than I do because I think he was the one who did the original research about the neighborhood that Pendergast came out of and how it, the nightlife developed and how Pendergast as uh, an urban boss kind of figure, he was the guy who would cash the paychecks for the workers, and then they'd spend money in his bar, so he'd get it back. But he also then he moved into uh, he expanded from just like being a bartender to a manager to a nightclub owner, and he was the guy who saw this as a strategy matter that uh, if prohibition shut down the bars and shut down his liquor business, he could shift from wholesale to retail.
Yeah.
He had a liquor business on the wholesale side, but when that was shut down, he went into the retail side, and it was known, I guess, uh, you paid off the police, obviously, to keep your bar open.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Did you see the Robert Altman film he did called Kansas City?
I did. I did many years after the fact.
Yeah, what did you think in regards to kind of encapsulating what you were trying to capture? What did you think about it?
Um, well, I think Altman is a great director. I mean, I've seen a lot of his films.
Yeah.
It's great that he's from Kansas City because he certainly had the desire to make a great film, and I think in many ways he did. The thing that I found slightly lacking was I didn't think those musicians were anywhere near the quality of Lester Young, for example,
Yeah.
and the various musicians that they were trying to portray. I think they fell short, and that's
Me too.
and it's kind of sad to say that, but back in the day, jazz musicians had a lot more competition. I mean, they had cutting contests, they had all night jam sessions,
That's
they
it.
had breakfast dances. They would play all night, and then they'd be playing because they couldn't go to bed yet. I mean, they got off at like 2 and 3 o'clock, so they just keep playing,
Uh-huh.
and people would come in for breakfast. So that doesn't exist anymore, and part of it is obviously jazz has lost market share, almost all of it to rock.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, unions uh, figured out that, well, for us to survive as a membership organization representing the rights of our workers, we have to control supply. So they banned jam sessions. It used to be, and some of these clubs, they all had a kitty up front, and jam sessions weren't quite the disorganized thing you might think they were. They would announce a jam session would begin like at midnight on Tuesday night or Monday night, which was musicians' night off, and they'd have to hire a drummer, and they'd have to hire a piano player and a bass player, and then they'd have the horns come in by classes. So I was just reading about a jam session that took place in New York, and first, it started out with the tenor saxes and Coleman Hawkins, a couple of rookies get up, and then Coleman Hawkins gets up and he blows them all away.
Uh-huh.
And then they go, okay, let's hear from the altos. And Johnny Hodges comes up and he plays first because he's the king of the alto. And then he says, okay, let's get some of the rookies up here. And they would they would alternate that way. And did you make a lot of money? No. You did get fed and you did get liquor. And the union obviously, it's looking at this and saying, well, wait a minute, we can't take a cut of ham sandwiches and beer. We need for them to get paid.
Yeah.
So they basically, and I think it was Dizzy Gillespie who gave the greatest anecdote about this. He said, you got to watch these union guys like they're cops. They're going to come around and they're going to stop you from playing in a jam session.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It's interesting because the local 627 was at the Mutual Musicians Foundation, and that was the mighty union that was local. That that building still has late night jams, but the history that went through that place alone is astounding.
Yep. Yeah, I've been there, and I think I think they do a great job of memorializing sort of the heroes of Kansas City Jazz. You see all those great pictures that they have on the walls.
Yeah.
Uh, but I just think the loss of the jam session culture is really hurt musicians today.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
certainly has. So let me ask you this. What did you learn about Kansas City Jazz that was almost revelatory or unexpected during this process? I mean, you go in with an idea of what you're going to do and what you hope to capture, but what was the most surprising parts about really exploring the history of Kansas City Jazz?
well, I think it was the organic nature of uh, uh, the riffs that built one on top of the other. So that I mean, if you listen to some Count Basie stuff, and I often get through with a Count Basie number, and I go, "What was that song?" It's like the old format was A, there are two A courses, there's a B bridge, and then there's an A, and you're closing out. But that's not how a Count Basie song bills. And the reason for that is the guys would contribute riffs as they were going along. So you'd have Hot Lead Page, he'd start something out and he'd play a riff, and the guys that build on it, then somebody in the sax section would think of an elaboration on that. So the saxes would take over, and these things sort of built organically. It's almost like a coral reef in the ocean. It's not plotted like, for example, a Duke Ellington song might be. So, and that's it's always been kind of a mystery to me, like Moten Swing. I can listen to Moten Swing until the day I die, and I kind of go, how did that happen? Because it's just a succession of riffs shifting and building on each other. It's not the sort of circular go back to the beginning format of a AABA, typical song.
Yeah. The one thing that's interesting about you bringing up Benny Moten was that they said that if he would have taken over what Count Basie did, because he had a freak accident with his tonsils and he died relatively early. They said that his power as a musician was better than Count, and he would have just been a whole different stratosphere.
Well, and this is something else I had to sort of grapple with to understand. So, Count Basie was a great opportunist. He was a great uh, visionary. He had a vision of what he wanted a band to sound like, but he didn't have a band.
Yeah.
He got stranded in Kansas City because his vaudeville show broke up, and the way that it used to work was the vaudeville show would go out. They'd play like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, but you couldn't go back the way you came because you would be playing for the people you just played for. So often these guys would get stranded and the band would break up and they'd have to ride the rails back home. So he gets out there and he has no band. His vaudeville show breaks up, and he starts hanging around other bands, to see where he can get in. And he plays. He says, I found a couple bars where I could play. They let me sit down at the piano and I'd play for tips and I'd get a couple drinks and a meal. But he starts hanging around with Benny Moten, and that's okay with Benny because Benny's such a businessman. He's one of these guys who he probably had two or three bands going at the same time. So if Count Basie comes in and says, can I play piano tonight? Benny's going to say sure, and he's going to go off and take care of something else. So it was not a seamless transition, but I'm not sure what would have happened if Benny hadn't lost his life in that tonsillectomy, because at some point, either he would have moved aside for Count and said, okay, I'm going to go out and start a second band. This will be Benny Moten number two. And he, in fact, did have some, junior varsity bands that way. So at some point, and I think it probably would have come when Count Basie butted heads with Bus Moten, who is sort of the he's the Joker in the deck of Kansas City Jazz.
Yeah.
Because let's imagine that Benny had handed the band over to Bus, his cousin, and Bus was trading on the Moten name. That wasn't his real name. He
Yeah.
had a different name, and so if Benny Moten had died and Bus Moten and Bus Moten had taken over, you could have had a Lawrence Welk situation where the lead instrument in the band was an accordion.
Yeah. Right.
That would have been a terrible outcome for Kansas City Jazz.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that uh, there's a phrase, he's seen his opportunity and he took him, which is I forget who the political boss is. It's like Tammany Hall, and Count saw his opportunity and he took it, which was he started playing in a nightclub, and the owner said, why don't you put a band together? And he sort of began to snatch people off of Bus Moten's bandwagon and put together his own band.
Yeah. So I want to kind of cherry pick sections out of the book. And one of the things, and I want to hit signature pieces of Kansas City Jazz. The big thing about Kansas City Jazz is that it had that blues to it. From your research and what you figured out about it, what was interesting? Who did you see really infusing that blues vibe that ended up becoming a signature part of the Kansas City Jazz sound?
Well, what's strange to me is, I mean, you think of Count Basie, you think of him as a blues uh, piano player, and he led a band that was based on the blues. But when he came west from, he's from Red Bank, New Jersey. He played in New York, played in movie theaters behind Fats Waller, and he came out here, and he was, the opening scene in the book is that he's in his hotel room. It's actually a boarding house because blacks couldn't go to hotels, and he's got a terrible hangover. He's been drinking this wild concoction that is, it's got berries in it, but it's like grain alcohol, and he's got this terrible hangover. And he hears a band, and he thought that somebody in the boarding house had a new record. He starts walking up and down the halls of the boarding house in his underwear, saying, "Whose record is that?" And somebody finally says, "No, no, that's Walter Page's Blue Devils. They're going through town on a ballyhoo." So a ballyhoo is when you got a wagon basically, and you drove through town with your band members on the back, playing music and saying, dance tonight at the Shriners Hall or the Oddfellows Hall, whatever. So Basie literally goes back to his room, puts on his pants, and goes out to follow Walter Page's, truck uh, around the town. And he likes what he hears, and he says, "I'd never heard blues played that way before." So it's really Walter Page and what he had developed in the Southwest. And, how did that blues get into Walter Page's head? Well, they were, uh, they were Oklahoma based,
Yeah.
and you had musicians coming up from New Orleans, uh, and they would come up the Mississippi, go up the Missouri, and get stranded there or stay because they found it more hospitable. They found it more hospitable than Mississippi, but they brought the blues with them,
Yeah.
and it got sort of transformed in the process. I mean, if you listen to New Orleans jazz versus Kansas City, I mean, New Orleans is more of a 2/4. Kansas City is very much a 4/4. Was that going on elsewhere in the country? Yeah, I mean, Duke Ellington switched his emphasis from 2/4 to 4/4
Uh-huh.
when he went into the Cotton Club, or at least that's what people said they perceived. So the form of blues that became to bubble up from the Southwest was fundamentally different than what Count Basie had heard on the East Coast.
So the other part of the lore of those early days was when you get anthologies of Kansas City jazz, Andy Kirk and the 12 Clouds of Joy are always very prominent in that collection, and they just had a very unique sound. What did you learn about the 12 Clouds of Joy?
Um, well, Andy started out in Denver, and they're actually, Denver had some very significant jazz musicians who were sort of out there in the Rockies, stranded, but they developed their own strain of music. And as Andy said, he grew up in an area with basically no racial discrimination. I don't think the schools were segregated. And so he never had any kind of animus towards white people. He never had uh, a view in his mind that he had to play only for blacks. He played for both blacks and whites. And so his music is smoother, it's a bit sweeter, but it can also be very hot. But he was a very well trained musician, so it wasn't as if he was picking stuff up on the fly like some of the blues guys did. Um, and for a time, he was the hottest band in the country because he appealed to both black and white audiences.
So the other most famous export from Kansas City is Charlie Parker. And there's
Right.
been so much from the Clint Eastwood film. You'd mentioned Chuck Haddock. He's written a book. There's been a lot of people that have covered his life. What did you learn about the mighty Charlie Parker during your examination?
Um, well, I found just about every anecdote I could, and I trimmed them down because it could turn into a book about Charlie Parker. I think he's obviously the apotheosis of the whole style. And I knew about his auto accident in the Ozarks. Um, what I was surprised to learn was so when he was woodshedding after he had the nearly fatal accident in the Ozarks going down to play in the mob controlled clubs down at the Lake of the Ozarks was he memorized Lester Young solos. So I had always viewed Parker as kind of a quantum leap up from Lester Young. Like they weren't that close in style. In fact, Parker was such an original that it was different. But apparently, and as you go back and listen, I think you can hear Lester Young and Charlie Parker's style, which I had never picked up on. And in fact, I had always had Parker up on such a pedestal. I sort of like looked down on Lester's like, well, yeah, that's great, but you're not Charlie Parker. It's like, oh. And then I find out that he spent all like months at a time, slowing down Lester Young solos and playing them until he memorized them.
The other part of that time period too, I remember that was when he was starting to get hooked on the pills and heroin and all that happened because of the pain that he had, is that he went back to the roots of classical music and he used that as kind of a bedrock of advancing his knowledge of jazz, you know. That
Right.
that yeah. Chuck Haddock had that in his book, and I thought that was interesting that he kind of went to the beginnings. And you hear that a lot with jazz musicians. A lot of them were trained in classical, but they wanted that freedom. They wanted that improv. But all
Right.
of that was the bedrock, which is why jazz is it's the American classical music, so to speak.
Right. No, I completely agree with that. And another guy who was the same way was Coleman Hawkins, who he's not usually considered a Kansas City jazz guy, even though he's from St. Joseph and played in Kansas City a lot, because he became famous so quickly. He was gone to New York very quickly. But it's interesting. There's a book called The Devil's Horn, and I'm forgetting the author's name right now, but I can look it up. It's in my book. Um, which has a lot of anecdotes about Charlie after he got to New York and he was sort of established. I mean, Charlie Parker was a musical polymath. I mean, he'd go into a bar and he'd be talking like to Ukrainians and he'd say, "Well, you got to listen to pictures of next at an exhibition by Mussorgsky," and then the Ukrainian goes, "Oh, what do you know?" Like this, and of course the other thing that about so Charlie hit the high notes, the highest level, and on the at the bottom, I don't want to say the bottom because I like country music too, but he's sitting in a bar one night in New York. He's putting nickels in a jukebox and he's playing country music, and one of his bandmates going, "Charlie, what are you listening to that crap for?" And he goes, "The stories, man, the stories."
Yeah.
So he went from high culture to low culture very easily and created his own style.
The other interesting thing about Kansas City at that time, and it was part of Prohibition, but it was also a part of the whole town was alive. We were the Paris of the Plains, was that Mary Lou Williams came here. And for me, Mary Lou Williams, and it was because she was a female and all of that at the time. She was one of the best musicians ever. And they said that she really, when she left Pittsburgh and came here, she really grew up here in Kansas City.
She did, and you know, um, so Andy Kirk's band played that number for her, "The Lady Who Swings the Band," which basically is a tribute to Mary Lou,
Yeah.
and they name check her throughout. Um, And I personally like her stuff. I think it's kind of a sad story because um, she was abused as a little girl by a cruel babysitter. She grew up with a stutter. She was very insecure. She was basically abused by, Don Bias, her husband. At the time, she was with Andy Kirk. And then there's another trumpet player who as I read two biographies of her. And so she finally gave up. I mean, so she had a tough life. And when she left jazz, the incident that drove her out was, she had some childhood uh, souvenirs like coins that her dad had given her and some jewelry. And the guys on the band bus were just terrible thieves. I mean, they'd steal because they didn't have enough money. They'd steal stuff.
Yeah.
So somebody stole her souvenirs, her family, her treasured souvenirs, and that's when she just walked off a stage one night and says, I'm not doing this anymore." And she became very religious and began to compose. Uh, she she recorded a mass, and it's interesting. Her manager for a time was a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
So yeah, she's a very interesting figure.
Yeah.
Uh, I have listened to her quasi-classical stuff. I don't know what to call it. It's not so much that it's not. I mean, all jazz is classical if it's within the tradition, but her stuff, her sacred music, I guess is the best way to put it. I think it's pretty good, and I don't listen to a lot of sacred music.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. So I'm gonna another person that's central in this timeline of Kansas City was Jay McShann. He was a Titan. And he still gets referenced. He's still a part of that kind of bloodline that still has a big echo in this town. They just did a documentary on Amazon Prime called Sounds of the City, and it was a broad look at Kansas City jazz. And at one point in that documentary, and this just came out this summer, they said that Jay McShann may have been the original source for rock and roll. He may have been the first one that did it.
He certainly had that beat. Um, so the story of Jay is he and Don Bias went to high school together, and they started playing in bands together when they were in high school, and uh, it was incredible the schedule they kept up. I mean, they were playing like two and three gigs a night on weekends, and Jay was primarily self-taught. And so he had that sort of, the boogie woogie beat. I mean, you're playing in these little hole in the wall bars, and you've got to create your own bass because you don't have a bass player. And you're expected to create both the melody and the rhythm. And so I hear it in his left hand a lot. I'm not sure. I mean, rock and roll has a lot of fathers. It's questionable paternity for anybody to say he's a
Yeah,
father of rock and roll, but
certainly.
I do hear I know what they're talking about when they say that.
So when you boil down Kansas City musicians, jazz musicians, who would you say would be in the top five for you?
Jay McShann. I mean, I love the guy,
Yeah.
and I love the guy probably for a lot of the wrong reasons. I mean, he like I is sort of like he had two older sisters, and his parents paid for piano lessons for his two older sisters, but not for him. So he snuck into one of his sister's piano lessons one time. Piano teacher leaves the room and she says, "Okay, practice that while I'm gone." He gets on the piano, he starts playing, and she goes, "Well, finally you got it." And she comes back in the room and she only then realizes it's Jay and not his sister playing.
Yeah.
Well, I had the same situation. I had two older sisters, both of whom got piano lessons. I didn't. I was told, go out and play football. You're not. We don't want you playing the piano. So I started noodling around, and I'm continuing to learn to this day. I never had piano lessons as a kid, but I had a rock band in high school, and of course I played organ, which is a lot easier than playing a piano because you just put your hands down on the chord. You don't have to move your fingers very much.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's my personal favorite. I have an extensive collection of his stuff. Uh, I have to say Charlie Parker is right up there too. I mean, he's the protean talent, and I listen to his stuff, and the thing that amazes me so much is there's like zero anger in his music. I mean, everything is joyful,
Yeah.
everything is pleasing. And I listen to guys who came after him, and they think that they have to be angry and annoying, And I go, you're nuts. Are you saying to me that you're a better saxophone player than Charlie Parker? Listen to Charlie Parker.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
everything he says is very pleasant.
Yeah.
So that's two. And Don Bias, I tend to favor romantic saxophonists. So my top three are Ben Webster,
Yeah.
Don Bias, and Johnny Hodges. And Ben Webster is a true Kansas City musician. He was born in Kansas City. Don Bias gravitated there, like Jay McShann. They both came from Oklahoma. So I guess I got one more. Is that right?
Yes.
Uh, um, I guess I'd have to say Benny Moten because he did so much to create or to transform all the ragtime that was going on. I mean, Missouri was this incredible center for ragtime, and it's just
Yeah.
and that was the other thing I got into, and I'm trying to figure out why it was, and it has to do sort of with the history of public entertainment, which and private entertainment, which was before there were stereos, before there were Victrolas. If you wanted to have music in the house, you bought a piano,
Yeah.
and every home that sort of viewed themselves as upwardly mobile, striving middle class, you bought a piano on an installment plan, and one of your children learned how to play it.
Yeah.
So the piano became this sort of parlor instrument. You know, you'd have company over and have your daughter play, but that also meant there were a lot of pianos out there for just general consumption. Scott Joplin, who came through, Sedalia up from Texas, he actually got some formal instruction at the Smith College for Negroes in Sedalia. So he had some actual, composition training. But the guys who played in the saloons, unlike in New Orleans, where they were playing a different style, the guys who were playing in the saloons in the Midwest and the Southwest were playing ragtime, and it essentially got transformed. I mean, ragtime is very formal. Yes, it's syncopated, but the beats are very regular. And the theory that I subscribe to, which after doing a lot of reading, is that structure got loosened up because they had a blues in the right hand. So you got the left hand with the rhythm, and you got the right hand. Uh, in ragtime, it's very regularly syncopated. If it's blues lines, you're essentially imitating a human voice,
Yeah.
singing a lament. And so it's going over and it's syncopating on an irregular basis. And that sounds, technical, but and so that's, for me is what happened in the Southwest was unique in that respect.
So, doing this examination of Kansas City jazz, how did that process help you evolve as a writer and your appreciation for jazz?
Uh, well, it taught me to write even faster than I was writing before because I was under such a tight deadline.
Yes.
I have to say, so Alan Shipton, as I say, is a world-renowned jazz expert, and when I started writing the thing, I was picking up a lot of, obviously, and I'll be totally honest. I mean, I think Ross Russell's book is great. I think Drakes and Haddock is great. So I was picking up stuff that had become sort of folklore that they repeated. And Alan, to his credit, said if I said, for example, this trombone player was playing, this style, and this was new to Kansas City, go, what about this guy in New York? What about and he knew the whole country basically.
Yeah.
And I'd have to go back and listen to it. And he reformed my views. And I think, uh, as I say, if I added anything, it was insights that he had translated in my language and my listening uh, that came out to slightly different conclusions than prior writers had come to.
Yeah. So we've done really good with running away with our allotted time here. This book, the beauty of this book was that it was released in 2023, but it's timeless. This is going to become an archival piece of Kansas City history. It's a wonderful book. I urge everyone to go out and pick up a copy. If you want to know what happened in Kansas City, this is the book to pick up. So I appreciate you taking a minute out, examining this book a little bit. It's been an honor and a joy. I appreciate it.
Thanks. It's fun to be on.
And is there anything else on the horizon coming up for you jazz wise?
I have just started, although I don't have a contract for it yet. I have a publisher interested in doing a biography of Harry Carney, who was
Okay.
Duke Ellington's longtime baritone sax player. He's sort of the anti-jazz musician biography subject because he never got in an argument with Duke. He never broke up with Duke. He drank, but nobody ever saw him drunk. He never did drugs.
Yeah.
He's brought up in a very stable household, mother and father, one brother. I was kind of urged to do this by other people in Boston who said, well, you did a biography of Johnny Hodges. Harry Carney's from Boston too. Why don't you do him? And I sort of went like, Harry Carney. Well, the thing is, writing biographies about people who play at the lower part of the musical staff is hard because you
Yeah.
can't pick them out.
Uh-huh.
But I realized after going back and listening to some of my Ellington records uh, that I really liked a lot of the stuff I really liked was Harry playing, and what Duke did with Harry, and which got him more attention than, for example, Jack Washington and Count Basie's band was Duke would score the baritone sax higher up in the register.
Yeah.
So when you hear, for example, Sophisticated Ladies or one of the other Ellington standards, you'll often hear Harry Carney's baritone sax playing it higher than the tenor or the alto. And
Yeah.
that was just, Duke's, uh, he learned, as he said, as a composer, riding around Central Park with Will Marion Cook, who was a successful violinist and composer who said, learn the rules and then break them. And that's exactly what Ellington did.
Yeah.
And it carried through to the extent that when guys in Ellington's bands introduced him to Thelonious Monk, they said, you got to listen to this guy. This guy's great. It's totally new. So they play him Monk, and Ellington goes, he's stealing my stuff because, because he was breaking rules.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely. Well, I love your writing. Kansas City Jazz. If anybody wants to get a copy, is the best place Amazon?
Amazon is the easiest, yes.
Okay. All right. I will put links in the show notes. Con, great to catch up with you again. This is our second time. Hopefully, we'll have a third more down the line. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you. See you.
You bet.
Neon Jazz.